was asked what the nature of Macleod's final illness was. He had rheumatoid disease for a number of years. He had one episode where I presume he had a gastric bleed, which would likely be related to, I don't know, was it handfuls of aspirin that would have been the treatment of the day? I don't think anything more toxic had been invented yet, but that was one episode. Then he also spent several weeks in a sanatorium because he was becoming increasingly frail. And it's recorded in Michael Williams' book that he always said to those staff attending to him, "Don't tell Mrs. Macleod that I'm ill, tell her that I'm fine." He died of the fairly standard death certificate stuff of, I think, chest infection and cardiac failure, which I presume would have been written in a very large proportion of elderly deaths. Not that 58 was terribly old, but there's no evidence that there was any specific rheumatoid disease related link to his death, but there may have been.
No autopsy?
It's not recorded. I wonder how many people dying at home in 1935 would have been referred for autopsy. Probably vanishingly small number. So, no.
It's a little curious dying that quickly with rheumatic disease. Anyways. So the other quick I want to ask you, Ken, is, I've sometimes visited institutions, like I visited one about 5 years ago at Downstate University, where had got the Nobel Prize 20 years ago. And it's the only one that ever was awarded to Downstate University, at least in physiology or medicine. It still was a major thing. How come that Aberdonians, or is this just a sort of Scottish inwardness?
Well, anyone who's been in my company in the last couple of days will know how quiet and reserved we are and don't have very much to say. And would never have anyone playing a clip of bagpipe music during dinner. There is, I suppose, some tendency in the area for people to be relatively quiet, not to make too much fuss. We'll leave that to central Scotland, but I need to be careful because I don't know where all your diaspora influences came from. It's a great pity that not more is made of this amazing man. And he was still is the only Nobel Prize winner from the University of Aberdeen that was homegrown. There were several others who worked in the establishment at some point in their postgraduate careers. But Macleod's the only one homegrown. And as I explained yesterday, I mean, the most astonishing part of the story for me was when I interviewed my former mentor, Michael Williams, 2 or 3 years ago, on his memories of working on and writing Macleod's biography, that the story emerged, which I told yesterday in the Mike Williams slide, about how he was from a local family. He went to Aberdeen Grammar School. He went to Aberdeen University Medical School. He would have studied in Macleod's department only 14 years after he died. He became a specialist in diabetes, and he had been this for 14 years and reached the age of 51 or 52 before he heard of Macleod for the very first time when he read Michael Bliss's book. Astonishing.
Dr. Angel.
At its head. In fact, it's Aesculapius. Caduceus has got 2 serpents.
And that only had one?
Yes.
Yeah, do you know what it costs to chip granite? It's quite expensive. So I stand corrected. Stand corrected.
In your next after dinner talk.
When I go back to the university, who don't pay any attention to me or Macleod, it seems, I'll tell them about that and see if the classics department will pick up with the story. Thank you.
Any other questions to Dr. McCarty? Please.
I mean, in Aberdeen, do you not have a plaque that says, here's all our Nobel Prize winners, and by the way, Macleod's da, 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 da. I mean, is it part of the medical school curriculum? I mean, are people being educated on this? I mean, it seems like a big miss. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, the answers are apparent from all that I've already said. No, there
No.
ain't nothing. And what we did in the clinical service, my final pictorial slide yesterday showed Michael Bliss performing the official opening of our not new but repurposed building for our diabetes clinic,
right,
which we named the JJR Macleod Centre.
cool.
And Michael came and formally opened that in November 2013. But the university doesn't have very much in the way of recognition of Macleod.
Seems like they need a marketing department, don't you think?
Do they teach history of medicine in the university in any formal sense?
Yeah, I was asked that earlier. As far as I'm aware, and it's a year or two now since I did the course, and they only ever let me teach the bits related to my clinical specialty. So as far as I'm aware, there is no element of medical history teaching obligatorily included in the medical undergraduate course. Those of us who were lecturing on areas like management of diabetes would have done our best to raise the profile of those people we knew about who were worthy of recognition. There has in a number of recent years, and this was partly my allusion to Macleod's education paper in atypical subjects, there has been in recent years, maybe now 15 years, humanities teaching, they call it, whereby students largely choose from a selection of topics to study. And I know that medical history is quite a popular choice, but I'm afraid I can't tell you whether there's anyone that's got a teaching role that oversees that particular aspect, or whether they're always just working with an interested clinician who knows something about a historical topic.
Here we have handed chairs with history of medicine and medical schools. So it is a more of a ingrained, although it's limited. I mean, there's a limitation and it's sort of seen more optionally than it should be, I think. Although there was a tradition of history of medicine earlier. I mean, just in the education in the earlier days, and even in the time of Macleod, they were actually doing more history of medicine as part of their course. Like there's more historical kind of allusions and references in their lectures and so forth. History
of medicine was one of the courses that Macleod introduced.
Yeah,
I think it's recorded.
exactly.
Let me call on Dr. Patricia Brubaker.
So I would put it that a recurring theme of this entire story has been the unwillingness of Macleod and also of Collip to put forward their contributions to this story. They taciturn, they opted out of the sort of mess that was created. And I would suggest that there's very little about Collip and his role in the discovery of insulin at the University of Alberta, just as you've discussed for Macleod in Aberdeen.
Well, there's been some recent stuff. Allison had a talk there recently, and so Allison has some experience with that as well. So I think there's a plaque. I think there's a couple of things that have happened more recently, at least.
Right, it's
Yeah.
starting, but I think it probably started with the unwillingness of both of these key players to talk about it.
Yeah. Sort of limitation of history too, is, you know, when you, I mean, it's kind of a byproduct of the primary people defining history itself, and that and the role Best played in that made things kind of very difficult because he was, I mean, he lived longer than everybody else, and there's all kinds of factors in that story as well. So,
Jim, what would you say to Patricia's question?
So a little bit tangentially, Collip, when he was in Toronto, was a PhD, and he was already, a professor at University of Alberta, which was at that point a fairly new medical school. And in fact, it only provided the first 2 years of education. So there was no possibility at the time, before the discovery of insulin, when Collip first started there, to actually do the last 2 years. And so the dean of the medical school, or actually maybe it was the president of the university, had a very strong relationship with McGill. And so traditionally the students from University of Alberta, after doing their first 2 years, would go to McGill to finish their last 2 years, where they would have access to teaching hospitals. Collip, when he came back from Toronto and returned as a professor, he quickly decided that he wanted to get a medical degree. So he enrolled as a medical student at University of Alberta, graduated, and then ended up heading off to McGill shortly thereafter. It's interesting that the Alberta kind of medical association 15 or 20 years ago picked the 100 most important physicians in Alberta, and Collip was listed, but he actually never practiced in Alberta, because as soon as he graduated from medical school, he ended up heading east. And so I guess I've probably gone a little bit tangential from your question. Pat, any?
Right, really, the
Oh,
comment was how much
recognition?
recognition
Yeah.
is there? I mean, Collip is often talked about in the PTH, for example, field, but I'm wondering in his hometown sort of thing, is there
Yes.
due recognition?
So in Edmonton, I would say that there's probably not huge recognition, but they did, Alberta did select him as one of their top 100 physicians, even though he never practiced a day in Alberta.
I think Alison Lee, she'll come on shortly, did comment that she had been out there and there was some recent recognition.
Yep, that's.
I want to call on Professor Norby.
No, just a brief comment apropos this topic of someone getting a Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine without having a medical degree. So the first one was Mechnikov, actually, I think we're on 1908 or so. And then August Krog did not have a medical degree. And after that, I don't know, I know there are a number of others, and Medawar was another person who did not have a medical degree. So there are a number of examples of people that have a prize in physiology or medicine without having any background in medicine.
So we're going to have Alison on very shortly, but so we have a very compelling story about Macleod. Michael was a big part of rehabilitating him. You three have all had stories that are powerful, indicating his key role, partly relating that he sort of diminished his role by being modest, as many Scotsmen are. And so, but what's missing here, that one looking ahead, that you would say, is there anything missing here that would make the story even more compelling, so that there would never be a question again, now 100 years later, about the total identifiable role of Macleod in the discovery of insulin? Is there anything missing? And I'd welcome comment from the audience who've also conjecturing, because can the issue really be put to bed?
I think so. And I'm not sure there's much more to be learned based on everything we've done and Michael's done. That's pretty obvious. It's more a question of willingness from the powers that be, as it were, here at U of T. It's my experience with doing exhibits for the last 10 plus years. There's been very, very positive response to that. So it's a question of actually presenting an idea, a specific idea to honor Collip, Macleod and Collip, but to balance the story out more broadly. I'm pretty sure there would be an acceptance of that in however way we want to do it. An idea I've had is a kind of a biographical focus on the four maybe even more, but 4 key people sort of on a display, not to regurgitate existing exhibits, but focused on the 4, sort of build around their experience, not only with insulin, but the other stuff, because they all were involved with other things, not just insulin, that were involved, that were important to U of T. So, and in terms of just evidence, I think there's plenty of it. It's pretty obvious. It's as you kind of mentioned in your talk, Banting and Best needed each other. It's actually almost a really brilliant to have the 2 as Nobel Prize winners based
Banting
on
and Macleod.
Banting and Macleod, as just to the way you kind of couched it and how we've all talked about it. It's such a mutual, interesting dynamic between the 2, apart from all the controversy, but actually they needed each other for this to work. And also Best and Collip obviously as well, but at core of it was the 2 of them and that relationship they had.
Thank you, Chris. Jim, what else? What do you think is missing?
So there's an interesting story, so when the Nobel committee was kind of adjudicating whether it should be just Banting or whether it should be Banting and Macleod, there's an interesting story from the time period when August Crowe came to Toronto in November of 2022. And there was a dinner where Crowe, Macleod, and Banting went to a nice fancy restaurant. And Banting was feeling particularly bold. And so he decided to basically describe the theory that he had as to how diabetes develops and progresses. And so this story is particularly interesting because I think it was, if I had to speculate, it may be the determining point when Crowe decided when he was going to go back and suggest who should get the Nobel Prize, that it had to be both of them. And the story is that Banting, and this is nicely described in Bliss's biography of Banting, published in 1984. But the story is that Banting had surmised that the cause of diabetes was hyperemia of the pancreas, that congestion, too much blood in the pancreas, and that this overstimulated secretion of insulin, and that the overstimulation of the secretion of insulin was the ultimate cause of diabetes. And so he proceeded to then explain that the correct treatment for diabetes would be essentially 3 things. 1, tell the patient not to eat as much sugar. 2, that provide insulin if necessary. And 3, wear a tight belt. And the rationale for the tight belt was that Banting had concluded, as many people observed at the time, that most diabetics were overweight. And so he concluded that it was the transverse mesocolon basically having too much adipose tissue, and that this tended to lower
yeah, it was in gallery view, so
that it impeded the blood flow away from the pancreas, causing congestion of the pancreas, and this was the cause of diabetes. And that an important part of treatment of diabetes was wearing a tight belt to hold the mesocolon up. And I suspect that was the determining, and actually Crowe politely pushed back on the idea and said, perhaps this didn't make perfect sense. And Banting, feeling very empowered, pushed back with Crowe and basically pushed his theory. So I'm suspecting that may have been the precise moment when Crow determined that Banting couldn't have done this on his own, that he really needed Macleod. And so, it's an old story, but it's not one that people often tell, but it is nicely presented in Michael's book on the biography of Banting.
It also kind of highlights the clash I was mentioning earlier about this older physician, hobby scientist coming up with an idea that actually works or doesn't work versus someone like Crow, who was very well established, and Macleod as well, and just how that kind of clashed.
Right.
But how they needed each other though, because the idea actually worked. So they had to kind of manage all that.
Yeah, there certainly would have been no discovery of insulin in Toronto without both of them.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. And Crow saw that pretty
I
clearly.
mean, Collip was obviously essential to get purity. Best probably could have been replaced by Clark Noble, and it may or may not have mattered. But the other three are essential.
Anyways, there wasn't a big rush for having tight belts across the nation, was there? So I'm going to again call on Professor Norby and then Dr. Angel.
Oh, very briefly, we have the privilege of hearing this story last night, and it just serves to mind August Krohn received his Nobel Prize because of his specialty of circulation, and
Yes.
then that was his really. So it was probably the wrong thing to advocate for Banting.
Yeah.
That I'm sure was totally horrifying to August Crow.
John, you bring up an important question about what need to go forward to enhance the story. I think what science is facing at the moment is the challenge of recognizing appropriate recognition for team efforts versus the individual in science. And this exemplifies, to my mind, the profound impact of a team effort in science that resulted in the identification, purification, and use of insulin clinically. And going forward, as science gets more complex, the role of groups and teams expand, and with it, the tension of ascribing both entitlement and priority in allocation of recognition. So the point I'm making here, of course, is going forward, we have to appreciate the fact that this is going to be a struggle for a while as science gets more complex and teams are being required to develop approaches to science.
In the context of U of T today, actually, the dean mentioned this in his introduction, just the team. I mean, they talk about that today. And I think there's an avenue to emphasize in terms of a new exhibit or somehow, rebalancing the people to cast it as the team, and the four members and maybe even others. So there's, I argue Dr. Fitzgerald is kind of the fifth Beatle in all this, or even Michael Bliss, or there's other people that are obviously very critical for this to actually work. So from the university's perspective, to do a new exhibit or some new recognition to rebalance that's the theme, to kind of tie it all together and have it being meaningful to current students and a way to teach them and to emphasize, and also emphasize the STEAM, like not just the STEM, but the STEAM, the important role of the humanities, history, the personalities, and just the whole dynamics of the human experience that made all this happen as well. It wasn't just a science issue. It was how to manage all these personalities and all that kind of elements are critical to a team working.
I think that there is an element in this story which is extremely challenging. And this is what Michael Bliss called the Banting-based myth. And in this day and age where so many people live on sound bites, it's much easier to subscribe to the myth that Banting had a unique and original idea in the night. He was an untrained scientist, and that made it all the more remarkable that despite opposition from everyone, he came up with a cure for diabetes. And despite what we've heard about all of the efforts over many years now to try to rebalance that story, there's still a popular perception that the myth is what is the truth. And I think it's going to be difficult to really take forward this team idea without perhaps undoing some parts of the myth to allow people to understand that banting was absolutely essential. He had a crude approach to science. The discovery of clinically useful insulin would not have been made in Toronto at the time it was without Banting's input. But he didn't have a unique insight in the middle of the night that led to the cure. And that's why the other people in the team have difficulty in being recognized, where perhaps their involvement is more complicated, more subtle than the sound bites or the myth can address. And even from the point of view of Banting, I think Banting had quite a wretched life after discovery of insulin. I think the parallel I would take is that I have worked alongside many clinical diabetologists who, the more that scientific data comes out impelling a certain approach to clinical practice to achieve these targets, when in the real world, our patients, by and large, make all their own choices and by and large don't achieve the holy grail of the best results. I know lots of clinicians who felt guilty and wanting, and it doesn't help them to support their patients to achieve the best if what they do is subscribe to this delusion that the absolute Olympic standard could potentially be in everyone's grasp. And so I think that if we're looking to take something forward, and the team approach is marvelous, and glory enough for all keeps being said, and there was more than enough glory for everyone, and that includes Banting. But it may need some unpicking, some more formal unpicking of some of the elements of the myth to improve the popular perception of what really happened.
Well, we'll come back to your point shortly. So let me, Dr. Norby, do you have another point?
Very briefly. So as we discussed yesterday, the maximum number of prize recipients is 3, defined by convention. However, it's a golden principle that each one of these 3 must be able to carry a prize on its own or her own.
Wow.
And that is important to reflect on.
Dr. Friedman. Just wait for the mic, please.
Fairly specific question and then a general one. The specific one is, Bliss describes in some detail that meeting in New Haven, I think in late 1921, where Banting presents the work and stumbles very much in the question and answer and is rescued, at least according to others there, not Banting, by Macleod. Was that the point at which the tension first erupted, or had it surfaced before then? And did it ever get better after that? That's the specific question. And then the general question is, in each of your minds, what are the unanswered questions that trouble you the most at this point?
In terms of the tension and relationship with Banting and Macleod, it predates that. That was sort of brought it to a climax, I suppose, in a public way. So everybody sort of saw it in front of them. But I mean, the situation had been stirring through the summer, and the letters back and forth that they had through the summer. And then when Macleod got back, that's when it really blew up, because in terms of funding and the facilities, Banting was pressing Macleod to get more facilities and more funds, because they were operating on very little, operating on fumes by that point. And so there's a lot of this sort of practicalities, and Banting had the upper hand because they actually something was happening here. And Banting was able to call on some people like Belly and Henderson, a few other allies, and Fitzgerald as well, to kind of help work, and for Macleod to kind of step in to help resolve that. So that was kind of the key thing. And then it kind of went from there, and never really recovered per se.
So I would agree entirely. I think the animosity started growing at the very beginning of the summer. I think Banting was not satisfied with the quality of the animal operating facilities he was being provided. He complained about the leakiness of the floor, that it was impossible to have things sterile. then the summer was, unbearably hot. And so I suspect, he and Best were constantly, probably complaining about their situation in the summer, how horrible it was. Best was initially paid, but only for the, either 1 month or maybe 2 months if he got Noble's stipend. But after that, he was not being paid. So neither of them were being paid towards, the hottest part of the summer. And, when Macleod comes back on September 21st, 1921, he is, he is immediately telling them, what controls they need to do, what experiments need to be repeated, etc. And, Banting becomes extremely irritated about that. And so, I think it was a relationship that just kind of tenuously held together, with multiple points of conflict. And, the Nobel Prize was the one that, brought it to the point that there could be no resolution after that.
Well, and just the fact that Macleod was away for the summer, and I don't think Banting would necessarily understand that. He was not really tuned into that academic, summers off and all that kind of stuff. So if Macleod had actually been there through the summer while this was all happening, it might have been a very different story, and the relationship might have actually been a little better, perhaps. But I mean, there with Banting and Best kind of on their own, struggling through the summer and all this stuff they were dealing with, but also showing progress. And that distance to Macleod just made it, from Banting's point of view, it made Macleod seem less relevant from in his own way.
The
Right.
experiments that were allocated were initially for 2 months. And Macleod was there for the first month. And but I mean, he had, his, trip to Scotland already planned. Banting had been very, had to make a very difficult decision as to whether he was going to actually do this. He had met with Macleod in the fall and to discuss the idea. And then, Macleod told him that he would not permit, or facilitate the work if Banting didn't commit to 2 months full time. And so Banting was probably a little bit irritated about maybe even before that, for not being allowed to do this on weekends, which was his initial plan. And so, so I think, it really was a matter of many different things. And, Banting was just not ready to accept, basically Macleod kind of telling him what to do. I mean, he's coming with his own idea and he wants to do it, and nobody's going to stop him. And, so I think it was ill-fated from the beginning.
So what I'd like to do.
I don't know. It seems a rich story. I'm not sure what to say. I mean, there's always been the question of Macleod's papers, which Bliss always found difficult, that there wasn't. We've had lots of Banting papers, lots of Collett papers, and lots of Best papers, but Macleod has always been kind of absent in terms of volumes. I mean, there's other stuff, indirect stuff, but no kind of personal papers or collections that have. At least I'm not sure. I don't think that's been resolved from your side there, to actually add in a little more perspective from a personal point of view and how we saw all this. Because I mean, again, we've talked about the reticence of this, how we handle all this. So
One thing that was compelling when Jim was talking about the fish experiments, that when Macleod went away in the summer, he was actually doing experiments, which was important. It wasn't that he was divorced from insulin experimentation. What I'd like to do is, there's 2 hands up. First, Pat Brubaker, and there was a lady in the back, I think in black. And we had to take those 2 questions, and then Allison, who couldn't come today, but is going to give a summary of what she's heard, encompassing today's talks and probably a bit of tomorrow. So let's Pat, what is your first question?
Well, this was really just a comment about what can we do going forward to correct this situation. And as many of you are likely aware, the medical sciences building where on the site where the studies initially took place, it does have a new tower that's being redeveloped. And I think that this would be an ideal opportunity to work with the Faculty of Medicine to move the discovery of insulin display into the new tower and then appropriately dedicate it, including with statues, for example, to the missing Macleod and Collip, combining them with Banding and Best, and perhaps a retelling of the story in a way that would be much more publicly accessible.
Thank you, Pat. I'm glad you said it because that's one of the goals is after Allison's summary, we're going to discuss just this very issue. What needs to be done? What needs to be recommended to the University of Toronto? And then basically the city in terms of improving their understanding. Please, your question.
Okay, I'm Jennifer Hubbard from formerly Ryerson University, historian of science, specialization in history of fisheries science. So this isn't my field, but I'm wondering if anyone has ever explored the parallels with the discovery of penicillin, in which Alexander Fleming got the credit initially and got the Nobel Prize as a sole discoverer. And then that had to be rectified because it was Howard Florey and Ernst Chain who had done the actual research on clinical applications of penicillin a couple of decades later. And I just see enormous parallels in the story, the problem of getting enough penicillin in the first attempts to treat patients. And I think it might be worth exploring that. And I'm not sure, certainly when I was growing up, I'd heard about Alexander Fleming. I never heard about Florey or Chain. And so I really do see a lot of parallels there.
Well, there
So
are.
that's a comment.
There are a lot of parallels, and I think it's been discussed. I'm not up on the details of it, but I know there's a lot of commonality between the two stories. But a lot of differences too. You have to understand this is the context of Fleming at the time and what was happening with him, and then sort of an absence of a gap. You know, you can actually move the story before Fleming because other people had discovered penicillin or something like penicillin before him. So it's a similarly complex story as insulin.
Professor Norby, do you have an answer to that question?
So the Fleming story is very special because the discovery was made at the end of the 20s and it took a long, long time. And it was the conditions during the World War II that they precipitated an enormous involvement in this. And clearly that would never have come to fruition without these other people, the two that shared the prize with him. And the fact that he was the first one to receive and use the product that they have managed to establish. And so it gives little glory to us. Like he's not only the discoverer, but also treating the first case, which was someone I think that he knew. But this whole story had been romanticized in so many different contexts. But it was really a true good biochemistry that really made this discovery that finally could bring this discovery to fruition.
Thank you. So let's now